Hey everyone, welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Today's video is different. I've got 6 real stories from people who went into abandoned cabins deep in the Appalachian Mountains during October. What they found inside changed their lives forever. These aren't just scary stories. These are real encounters that will make you never want to step foot in those mountains again. But before we dive into the nightmare, hit that subscribe button and smash the like. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your support means everything. All right, let's get into these terrifying true stories. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a telecommunications technician for a company that services cell towers across Virginia and West Virginia. Been doing it for about 8 years now, and honestly, it's usually pretty routine work. Drive up to a tower, run diagnostics, replace some equipment, drive home. Good pay, mostly solo work, which I prefer. My name's Carlos, and I don't talk about this much, but what happened to me last October still affects how I live my life today. The company sent me up to this remote tower near the Virginia-West Virginia border, way up on one of the highest peaks in that area. It was the week before Halloween, and we'd been getting complaints that cell service was completely dead for about 20 miles around. Emergency services were having issues, which meant this was priority 119. Get that tower back online before Halloween weekend, when the area would be packed with hikers and leaf peepers. The tower was located right next to this old fire lookout cabin that hadn't been used by the Forestry Service in probably 15 years. Just me, my truck, my equipment, and a week to figure out what was wrong. The drive up took me most of the morning, winding through these narrow mountain roads that got steeper and more remote the higher I climbed. Cell service died completely about 10 miles from the tower site, which wasn't unusual. That's why I was there in the fix-it. But what was weird was my GPS kept acting up, showing me in places that didn't make sense, like coordinates that would put me floating in empty space above the mountains. I figured it was just interference from whatever was wrong with the tower. When I finally made it to the site, the first thing that hit me was how quiet it was. I mean, mountain quiet is different from city quiet, but this felt wrong somehow. No birds, no insects, no wind through the trees, just this heavy silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. The tower itself looked normal enough, about 200 feet tall, surrounded by the usual equipment sheds and generator housing. The old fire lookout cabin sat maybe 50 yards away, windows boarded up, paint peeling, but structurally sound. I set up my equipment and started running diagnostics, and that's when things got really strange. The tower was definitely broadcasting signals, but my equipment was showing readings that shouldn't have been possible. According to my instruments, the tower was transmitting on frequencies that didn't exist, sending signals to coordinates that would put them somewhere out in space, way beyond Earth's atmosphere. I double-checked everything, ran the tests again, but the readings stayed the same. Looking back now, I should have called this in right away, but I'd been doing this job long enough to know that sometimes equipment gives you weird readings for perfectly normal reasons. Mountain weather can do strange things to radio signals, especially in October when the atmospheric conditions get all mixed up. I figured I'd spend the first day just trying to understand what was happening before I started making calls to my supervisor about impossible readings. That first night, I decided to stay in the old cabin rather than drive all the way back down to find a motel. The company had given me permission to use it if needed, and it seemed easier than making that winding drive in the dark. The cabin was actually in better shape inside than it looked from the outside, which still had power running to it, probably left over from when the Forestry Service used it as a communication hub. There was even an old landline phone mounted on the wall, though when I tested it, I just got dead air. Around midnight, that phone rang. I know how that sounds. Dead phone line, no service up here, but I'm telling you it rang. Not the electronic beeping of a modern phone, but that old mechanical bell ring that phones used to make. I stared at it for probably 10 seconds before I finally picked it up. Hello? The voice that answered wasn't quite right. It sounded human, male, but there was something off about the rhythm of the speech, like someone reading from a script they didn't quite understand. Carlos Martinez, Technician, Identification 77492, the voice said. Signal adjustment required for optimal transmission parameters. I felt the hair on my neck stand up. That was my employee ID number, but it wasn't printed anywhere on my equipment, and nobody at the company talked like that. "Who is this?" I asked, but the line had already gone dead. I checked the phone cord, still disconnected from the wall jack. The calls kept coming over the next 3 days, always on that dead phone line, always the same wrong-sounding voice. It knew things about me that nobody should have known. My mother's maiden name, the address of the apartment I'd lived in 5 years ago, the exact model of truck I was driving. But what really got to me was how it talked about the tower equipment. It knew the technical specifications better than I did, could describe the internal circuitry in detail, knew exactly which components needed to be adjusted and how. Antenna array requires 17-degree rotation clockwise, it would say. Signal amplification boost to 147% normal parameters. Output frequency adjustment to coordinates 37.456 north, 8 to 2.111 west, elevation infinite. That last part should have been impossible. You can't transmit to infinite elevation. But when I ran diagnostics after making the adjustments the voice suggested, the signal strength improved dramatically. The readings were still showing impossible data, KDDR, signals traveling beyond Earth's atmosphere, but the equipment was definitely working better. By the 4th day, I was starting to feel like I didn't have a choice in following the voice's instructions. Not because of any supernatural compulsion, but because every time I ignored its suggestions, the equipment would malfunction in dangerous ways. Fuses would blow, components would overheat, and once, a power surge nearly electrocuted me when I was working on the transmission array. But when I made the adjustments the voice requested, everything worked perfectly. That's when I started to understand what was really happening. The voice wasn't just giving me random technical instructions. It was systematically modifying the tower to broadcast on specific frequencies, to specific coordinates at specific times. And those coordinates, when I really looked at them, weren't pointing to locations on Earth. They were pointing to empty space, but not random empty space. The coordinates formed patterns, like someone was mapping three-dimensional locations in something that existed parallel to our reality. Phase alignment, achieving optimal parameters, the voice told me on the 5th night. Dimensional barrier reduction successful. Crossing window, approaching maximum stability. That's when I knew I had to look at what was in that abandoned cabin more carefully. The Forestry Service had left behind a lot of old communication equipment, NN, radio sets, weather monitoring devices, and a whole wall of communication logs dating back 30 years. I started reading through them, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. Most of it was routine stuff, weather reports, fire spotting data, maintenance schedules, but in the October entries, year after year, there were notes that didn't make sense. October 15th, radio receiving transmissions on unused frequencies. Unknown origin. October 23rd, personnel report interference patterns on all communication equipment. Voices heard on dead channels. October 28th, evacuation recommended due to equipment malfunction. Staff reporting disorientation and visual anomalies. One entry from 15 years ago caught my attention. October 30th, technician Williams disappeared during routine tower maintenance. Equipment found arranged in geometric patterns. Search discontinued due to dangerous interference levels. Williams. That was the name of the technician who'd worked on this tower before me. The one my supervisor had mentioned was no longer with the company. On Halloween night, I found out why. The voice called around 11 p.m., but this time it sounded different. More urgent, more excited. Final adjustments required. Dimensional crossing window optimal. Transmission bridge activation imminent. I could see lights through the cabin windows, not normal lights, but these cold white beams that seemed to come from the direction of the tower. When I looked outside, the tower was lit up like a Christmas tree, but not with its normal red aviation lights. These were intense white strobes that hurt to look at directly, pulsing in patterns that reminded me of Morse code. And then I saw them. They looked almost human from a distance, but as they got closer to the cabin, I could see the wrongness. Their arms were too long, hanging down past their knees. Their heads tilted at angles that would have broken a human neck. They moved with this jerky, mechanical precision, like marionettes being controlled by someone who'd never seen a real person walk. There were maybe a dozen of them, studying the equipment around the tower base, examining my truck, testing the door handles of the cabin. They moved like scientists studying specimens, poking at things, trying to understand how they worked. One of them picked up my toolbox and turned it over and over, like it had never seen tools before. The phone rang again. "Portal stabilization complete," the voice said, and I realized it was coming from one of the figures outside. Its mouth wasn't moving, but somehow I knew it was the source of all those calls. "Crossing successful. Your reality integration proceeding as planned." "What do you want?" I managed to say. "Population replacement initiative. Your species inadequate for optimal dimensional development. We provide improved reality structure." Through the window, I could see more of them emerging from what looked like tears in the air itself, stepping through gaps in reality that shouldn't have existed. They all had that same stretched, pale appearance, all moved with that same mechanical wrongness. But what terrified me most was how they studied everything with such careful attention, like they were planning to replace not just people, but our entire way of living. "You will maintain transmission equipment," the voice continued. "Signal bridge requires constant monitoring for permanent crossing access." That's when I understood. They weren't just crossing over for a visit. They were planning to replace us, and they needed the tower to keep broadcasting to bring more of them through. I was supposed to be their maintenance technician for an interdimensional invasion. I thought about Williams, the technician who disappeared 15 years ago. Had he gotten the same calls? Made the same modifications? How long had they been planning this? I had maybe an hour before midnight, and I knew that's when whatever was happening would become permanent. The old Forestry Service communication equipment included an emergency electromagnetic pulse generator designed to shut down all electronic equipment in case of dangerous interference. It hadn't been used in years, but if it still worked, it might be enough to cut the signal bridge. The hardest part was getting from the cabin to the equipment shed without being seen. Those things were still studying my truck, moving around the tower base, examining everything with that terrible scientific curiosity. I waited until a group of them wandered off toward the tree line, then made a run for it. The EMP generator was ancient, probably military surplus from the 1980 seconds, but it still had power. I started the charging sequence and watched the dials slowly climb toward full power. Outside, I could hear more of them coming through, their footsteps creating this strange rhythm that didn't match any natural walking pattern. At 11:47 p.m., I triggered the pulse. Every piece of electronic equipment within half a mile shut down instantly. The tower lights went out, my truck died, and the transmission equipment went completely silent. But most importantly, those tears in reality snapped shut like closing doors. The figures that were already through got cut off from whatever dimension they'd come from, and the ones still crossing got caught halfway. Just gone. Like they'd never existed. But some of them were still here. I could see them in the darkness, maybe 5 or 6 that had made it all the way through before I cut the signal. They moved differently now, more frantically, like they'd lost contact with whatever had been controlling them. They kept walking to where the portal had been, reaching out toward empty air, making these awful clicking sounds that might have been their version of speech. I stayed in the equipment shed until sunrise, listening to them search the area, testing doors, trying to get back to wherever they'd come from. When the sun came up, they just left. Walked off into the woods like they were following some invisible path. The tower was completely destroyed. Not just shut down, the EMP had fried every component, melted circuits, cracked the transmission array. It would have to be completely rebuilt from scratch. When my supervisor showed up 2 days later wondering why I hadn't checked in, I told him equipment failure had destroyed the whole installation. He fired me on the spot. I never told him about the calls, the modifications, or what I'd seen on Halloween night. Who would believe that? I destroyed millions of dollars worth of equipment and claimed it was an accident. They threatened to sue me for the damages, but eventually just blacklisted me from the industry. That was 6 months ago. I work construction now, moved to a place with minimal cell coverage, don't trust any electronic communication. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear my phone make sounds it shouldn't make, or my radio will pick up signals that sound like mathematical sequences. And sometimes, when I'm driving through remote areas, I'll see them. They're still here, the ones that got stranded. They watch from the tree lines, study people from a distance, try to figure out how to blend in. But they can't quite get it right. Their movements are still wrong, their timing off, like actors who've memorized their lines but don't understand the play. I keep track of cell tower maintenance schedules now, especially the October ones. Try to warn other technicians when I can, though most of them think I'm just some burned-out guy with conspiracy theories. Maybe I am, but every October, when the atmospheric conditions get right for long-distance transmission, I make sure to stay far away from anywhere with communication equipment, because they're still trying to call home. And someday, someone else might answer. I'm 28 years old, and I work as a line cook at this upscale restaurant in Charleston. I know that doesn't sound like much, but I'm good at what I do, and part of being good means knowing your ingredients. Every fall, our head chef puts together this seasonal menu featuring wild mushrooms, and it's my job to source the specialty varieties we can't get from our usual suppliers. That's how I ended up in the mountains of West Virginia last October, following some local forager's hand-drawn map to what he called the Mother Lode. I wish I'd never heard those words. The guy who gave me the map was this old-timer named Pete, who'd been selling mushrooms to restaurants around the region for maybe 30 years. He'd come by the kitchen one afternoon with a basket of chanterelles so perfect they looked like they belonged in a magazine. When I asked him where he found them, he got this look on his face, like he was debating whether to tell me something. Finally, he pulled out this folded piece of paper covered in pencil marks and said there was this cabin up in the mountains, abandoned for years, where the mushrooms grew like nothing he'd ever seen. But then he hesitated, said something about the place feeling wrong and that he didn't go there anymore. I figured he was just trying to protect his secret spot. The plan was simple enough: drive up on a Friday afternoon, camp overnight, and spend Saturday morning gathering enough specialty mushrooms to last us through the season. I had my camping gear, my mushroom identification guides, and a good camera to document anything interesting I found. The drive up took about 3 hours, winding through these narrow mountain roads that got progressively less maintained the higher I went. Pete's map was actually pretty detailed, marking old logging roads and creek crossings, and I found the turnoff exactly where he'd drawn it. The cabin sat in this little hollow maybe half a mile off the main road, accessible only by what used to be a dirt track, but was now mostly just 2 ruts through the undergrowth. As soon as I got out of my truck, I could see why Pete had called it the Mother Lode. Mushrooms were everywhere. I'm talking about varieties I'd only seen in books, growing in perfect fairy rings around the cabin, sprouting from dead logs in clusters the size of dinner plates. There were oyster mushrooms cascading down the sides of oak trees like frozen waterfalls, and patches of what looked like hen of the woods bigger than anything I'd ever imagined possible. But there was something else too. The air felt thick, almost sticky, with this sweet, sick smell that reminded me of fruit that had gone just past ripe. Every breath tasted slightly metallic, and I found myself having to consciously focus on breathing normally. The cabin itself was partially collapsed, with the roof caved in on one side, but it was completely covered in this fuzzy, grayish growth that looked like mold but moved slightly in the breeze. Or maybe I was imagining that part. I set up my tent about 50 yards from the cabin, close enough to keep an eye on my find, but far enough away that the smell wasn't quite so overwhelming. The whole area was eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, just this weird pressure in the air like right before a thunderstorm. I spent the rest of Friday afternoon photographing different species and taking notes, trying to identify some of the varieties I'd never seen before. There were these pale, almost translucent mushrooms growing in perfect spirals around the cabin foundation, and when I got close to photograph them, I could swear I heard this faint whispering sound, like wind through leaves, except there wasn't any wind. That night, I had the strangest dreams. I dreamed I was walking through underground tunnels made of white, fibrous material that pulsed like it was alive. In the dream, there were voices coming from the walls, multiple voices speaking in unison, telling me I belonged there, that I was finally home. I woke up around 3 in the morning with this overwhelming urge to go outside and walk to the cabin. It took everything I had to stay in my tent until sunrise. Saturday morning started normal enough. I made coffee on my camp stove and laid out my collection bags, planning to work systematically around the cabin, starting with the species I recognized and moving on to the unusual ones. That's when I noticed the patterns. The mushrooms weren't just growing randomly, they were arranged in these intricate geometric designs, like someone had planted them deliberately. Circles within circles, all radiating out from the cabin like ripples in a pond. I was photographing one particularly impressive cluster of what I thought might be lion's mane when I accidentally stepped too close and disturbed a patch of those pale spiral mushrooms. A cloud of spores erupted into the air, so thick I could see it floating like dust in the morning sunlight. I tried to step back, but I'd already breathed some in. The effect was immediate. The world suddenly became incredibly vivid, like someone had turned up the saturation on everything. Colors I'd never noticed before jumped out at me. The forest floor seemed to pulse with life, and I could hear sounds that shouldn't have been there. Whispers, definitely whispers, coming from the mushroom patches around me. I felt dizzy and sat down hard on a fallen log, trying to get my bearings. That's when I realized the whispers weren't random. They were synchronized, like a choir speaking instead of singing, and they were saying my name. I don't know how long I sat there, listening to mushrooms call my name, but when I finally managed to stand up, the sun had moved significantly across the sky. Hours had passed, and I couldn't remember any of it. My hands were covered in dirt like I'd been digging, and there was soil under my fingernails that I didn't remember getting there. Worse, I had this overwhelming craving to eat the mushrooms, even though I knew better than to consume anything I couldn't positively identify. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just some kind of allergic reaction to the spores, but the voices kept getting stronger. They weren't just saying my name anymore. They were having conversations, multiple voices overlapping, discussing me like I wasn't there, talking about how I'd fit into something they called the network. I was stuffing mushrooms into my collection bags, moving faster than I should have been when I saw movement near the collapsed cabin. At first, I thought it was other foragers, maybe locals who knew about this spot. But as they got closer, I realized something was very, very wrong. There were 3 of them, and they might have been human once, but not anymore. They moved wrong, with this jerky, puppet-like gait, like their joints didn't quite work the way they were supposed to. Their skin had this waxy, pale quality, and there were patches of fungal growth along their arms and necks, actual mushrooms sprouting from their flesh. But the worst part was their eyes, clouded over with what looked like spores, milky white and unblinking. They approached me in perfect synchronization, their heads tilted at identical angles, studying me with those horrible eyes. When they spoke, it was in unison, their voices overlapping into this eerie harmony that made my skin crawl. "You're breathing the spores," they said together. "You're joining the network. It's beautiful here. No more worry, no more pain, just connection." I backed away, but more figures emerged from the woods. Former hikers, maybe, or other mushroom hunters who'd found this place and never left. All of them showing the same fungal growths, all moving with that same unnatural coordination. I counted at least 7 of them forming a loose circle around me. "The October spores are strongest," they continued in their creepy chorus. "Perfect season for growth, perfect season for connection. You can feel it changing you already." And I could. My thoughts felt fuzzy, disconnected, like I was thinking through cotton. I kept losing track of what I was doing, finding myself just standing there, staring at the mushroom patches while time slipped away. Part of me wanted to give in, to stop fighting whatever was happening to me. The voices were so soothing, promising peace and belonging, and an end to all the stress of my regular life. But the cook in me, the part that had spent years learning about food safety and mushroom toxins, knew I was being poisoned. These weren't just any spores. They were changing my brain chemistry, rewriting my thoughts from the inside out. I remembered reading about parasitic fungi that controlled insects, making them climb to high places before killing them to spread more spores. This was the same thing, but worse, because it was keeping its hosts alive and aware while it controlled them. I started backing toward my truck, moving slowly so I wouldn't trigger some kind of chase response. The infected people, I couldn't think of them as human anymore, watched me with those terrible eyes, their heads swiveling to track my movement like owls. They didn't try to stop me at first, just kept talking in their synchronized voices about how beautiful it would be to join them, how the network would take care of everything. But when I broke into a run, they came after me. I'd never heard anything like the sound they made, not quite human voices, but not quite animal either. It was like the sound air makes when it's forced through a pipe, multiplied by 7 and harmonized into something that shouldn't exist. They moved faster than they looked like they should be able to, their wrong-jointed limbs carrying them through the underbrush with impossible coordination. I made it to my truck and got the engine started, but they surrounded the vehicle, pressing, their faces against the windows and leaving streaks of something that wasn't quite moisture on the glass. Their fungal growths were more extensive up close. I could see thread-like mycelia spreading under their skin like a secondary circulatory system. I gunned the engine and drove straight through them. I don't know if I hit any of them, and honestly, I don't want to know. I just kept driving, following the rutted track back to the main road as fast as I dared, expecting them to come pouring out of the woods after me at any second. The weird thing was, as soon as I got maybe a mile away from the cabin, my head started to clear. The fuzzy, disconnected feeling faded, and I could think clearly again. My GPS started working. I hadn't even realized it had stopped. The radio picked up stations again. It was like I'd driven out of some kind of dead zone. I drove straight home and didn't stop except for gas. Threw away all the mushrooms I'd collected, even though some of them were worth serious money. I couldn't risk it. Who knew what kind of contamination they might be carrying? That was 3 months ago, and I still don't feel completely normal. I quit the restaurant job because I couldn't handle working with mushrooms anymore. Even the regular ones from our suppliers made me nauseous. I moved out of Charleston, found work at a diner in Phoenix where the climate is too dry for most fungi to grow. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear whispers in the walls. And twice now, I've woken up to find small mushrooms growing in the corners of my apartment, even though that should be impossible in this climate. I did some research on parasitic fungi, and what I found didn't make me feel any better. There are species that can control their hosts for years, keeping them alive and functional while slowly spreading through their system. The mycelium networks can extend for miles underground, connecting entire forests into single organisms with collective intelligence. I think about those people I saw, the ones who joined the network. I wonder how long they'd been there, how many others might have found that cabin over the years. And I wonder if what happened to me is really over, or if those spores are still working their way through my system, just taking their time. I've never told anyone this story before now. Most people would think I was crazy, or making it up, or that I just had some kind of allergic reaction that caused hallucinations. But sometimes I catch myself staring at nothing for hours at a time, and I realize I can't remember what I was thinking about. And in those moments, I can almost hear those voices again, calling my name, telling me I belong with them. I won't go back to the mountains. I won't even look at a map of West Virginia. But I have this horrible feeling that someday, the mountains might come to me. The network is patient. It has all the time in the world. I was 24 when this happened, working part-time at a garage in Pikeville, Kentucky, trying to save up enough money to finally move out of my mom's basement. My buddy Jake called me up one Tuesday morning, said he'd bought some furniture at an estate sale online and needed help moving it. The catch was the stuff was way up in the mountains, maybe 40 minutes outside town, and he was offering me $200 for a day's work. I wasn't exactly in a position to turn that down. Jake had won the bid on the entire contents of this old cabin site unseen. The previous owner had died back in the spring, found by hikers after he'd been missing for weeks. Jake figured there had to be some good furniture up there, maybe some antiques he could flip. We picked October for the move because the weather was finally cooling down and we wouldn't be sweating our asses off hauling heavy stuff. The plan was simple: drive up early, load the truck, and get back to town before dark. October nights in those mountains get cold fast, and neither of us wanted to be stuck up there. The drive took us deep into the Daniel Boone National Forest, winding up narrow roads that seemed to get smaller and more overgrown the further we went. Jake kept checking his GPS, muttering about how the pin was supposed to be right around the next bend, but we must have driven 20 minutes past where we thought the cabin should be. Finally, around a sharp curve, we saw it. A log cabin tucked back in the trees with a rusted mailbox marking a gravel driveway that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The place was bigger than I'd expected, with a wraparound porch and what looked like a workshop addition built onto the back. But it was what was inside that made us both stop dead in the doorway. The entire front room was filled with mounted animals, dozens of them. Deer heads lined every wall, a massive black bear stood reared up in one corner, and there were smaller displays everywhere: raccoons, possums, wild cats, even a few birds of prey with their wings spread wide. The quality of the work was incredible. I'd seen plenty of taxidermy growing up at PS4 Half the guys I knew had deer heads in their living rooms, but this was different. These animals looked alive. Their eyes seemed to track you as you moved around the room, and the fur and feathers looked like you could reach out and feel how soft they were. Jake whistled low and said we'd hit the jackpot. Antique taxidermy like this could be worth serious money to the right collector. The workshop in the back was even more impressive. Every tool you could imagine for taxidermy work was neatly organized on pegboards and workbenches. There were bottles of chemicals with labels I couldn't pronounce, stretching boards, knives, and all sorts of specialized equipment. The guy who lived here had clearly been a professional, maybe even supplied work to museums or hunting lodges. But there was a smell in the air that bothered me. Sharp chemical odors mixed with something organic and wrong, like meat that had been sitting too long. As we started loading the smaller pieces into the truck, I found a journal on one of the workbenches. The entries went back years, documenting hunts and projects, but the later entries got weird. The guy had been tracking what he called an unknown species in the area. Page after page described finding tracks that didn't match any animal he knew, bipedal, but with claws, and way too big to be human. The final entries, dated just weeks before he disappeared, mentioned getting close to capturing the perfect specimen. That's when Jake called me from the back room. I found him standing in front of a massive preservation tank, easily 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, filled with murky liquid that smelled like formaldehyde and rotting fish. The tank was big enough to hold something human-sized, maybe bigger. Around it were all the tools and materials you'd need for a major preservation project, ED, enough to mount something that walked upright. The whole scene was starting to make me uncomfortable, but Jake was focused on the money we could make. He figured we could sell the tank to a medical school or research facility. I helped him drain it, trying not to breathe through my nose because the smell was overwhelming. That's when we noticed the damage in the workshop. Equipment was overturned, chemical bottles broken, and there were gouges in the wooden walls that looked like claw marks, but way too big and deep to come from any animal I knew. We found the guy's rifle in a corner, snapped clean in half. Whatever had happened here, a gun hadn't been enough to stop it. The blood stains on the floor didn't look like anything from normal hunting either. They were in the wrong pattern, like something had been dragged around the room. Jake was getting excited about all the gear we were finding, but I was getting a bad feeling about the whole place. The sun was already starting to get low, and we still had the heavy furniture to move. I suggested we come back the next day with more help, but Jake wanted to finish the job. He'd paid good money for everything in the cabin, and he wasn't leaving without it. That's when we heard the first sound from outside. Heavy footsteps on the roof, slow and deliberate, like something was testing how much weight the structure could hold. Jake looked up at the ceiling and joked that we'd disturbed a family of raccoons, but raccoons don't weigh enough to make the whole cabin creak. The footsteps moved from one end of the roof to the other, then stopped directly over where we were standing. We went outside to look, but there was nothing up there. The ladder the previous owner had used to check his gutters was still leaning against the house, but it would take something with serious climbing ability to get up there without using it. Jake shrugged it off and went back to work, but I kept listening for more sounds. They came about 20 minutes later. Breathing outside the windows, deep, steady breaths that were too slow and too loud for human lungs. We'd left the windows open to help with the chemical smell, and the sound was close enough that whatever was making it had to be standing right outside. I grabbed Jake and pointed toward the window, but by the time we looked, there was nothing there. Then came the scratching. Long, deliberate scrapes against the doorframe, like something was testing the wood with claws. The gouges it left were deep, going through the outer layer of the door and into the solid wood underneath. Jake finally started looking concerned. He suggested we load what we could quickly and get out of there, but when we tried the truck, it wouldn't start. Looking back now, I think we were being hunted. Whatever was out there had been watching us since we arrived, learning how we moved, how we reacted. It had cut something under the hood, not randomly, but specifically. It knew what it was doing. The scratching moved around the cabin methodically. First the front door, then the side windows, then the back door. It was mapping the building, finding the weak points. Through the front window, I caught a glimpse of something pale moving between the trees. It was standing upright, but its proportions were wrong, too tall, with arms that hung too long and joints that seemed to bend the wrong way. Jake found a loaded shotgun in the bedroom and handed me a hunting knife from the workshop. We barricaded the front door with furniture and tried to think of a plan. The thing outside had gone quiet, which somehow felt worse than the scratching. At least when it was making noise, we knew where it was. That's when it started using the taxidermist's voice, calling out from the woods, saying it needed help, that it was hurt. The voice was almost perfect, but something about the rhythm was off, like it was remembering how to speak rather than actually speaking. Jake almost went for the door before I stopped him. The real guy had been dead for months. The sounds got more aggressive as the night went on. Heavy impacts against the walls, like something was throwing its full weight against the cabin. Through the windows, we could see it moving around the clearing, studying us the way the taxidermist had probably studied his specimens. It wanted to preserve us, I realized. We were going to be the next additions to the collection. I remembered the preservation chemicals in the workshop. If this thing had been around when the taxidermist was alive, it might be vulnerable to the same substances he'd used. We mixed everything we could find, formaldehyde, acids, solvents, into bottles we could throw. The smell alone was enough to make our eyes water. Around 3 a.m, it finally tried to get inside. The front door splintered, but our barricade held. We threw the first bottle through the gap and heard something that might have been a scream, if screams could sound that deep and wrong. The scratching stopped. We waited until dawn before moving the furniture and checking outside. There were tracks in the mud around the cabin, prints that looked almost human, but with claw marks and a stride too long for any person. They led back up into the ridges, toward the higher peaks where the old-growth forest was too thick for most people to go. Jake's friend showed up with another truck around noon like we'd planned, but we were already packed and ready to go. We told him we'd finished early, didn't mention what had happened. Jake sold everything he'd loaded for less than it was worth, just to get rid of it quickly. The cabin was found completely destroyed a few weeks later, walls torn apart like something had taken out its anger on the place after we left. The authorities blamed it on a bear attack and closed the case. I moved out of Kentucky that winter, couldn't stand being in the mountains anymore. Even now, 5 years later, I can't look at mounted animals without remembering those eyes watching us through the windows. I've done research since then, found stories going back generations about October sightings in those mountains. Hunters who never came home, cabins found empty with signs of struggle. I work in an auto shop in Louisville now, strictly urban jobs. Jake still calls sometimes, trying to get me to help with estate sales, but I always find an excuse. Some money isn't worth earning, and some places are better left alone. The mountains keep their secrets for a reason, and after what happened in that cabin, I'm perfectly happy to let them. The taxidermist thought he was the predator, collecting specimens for his workshop. Turns out he was just another piece in someone else's collection all along. And if we hadn't been careful, if we hadn't gotten lucky with those chemicals, we would have been next. I was 33 when I took the temporary assignment that still keeps me awake some nights. I'd been working for the Postal Service for about 8 years at that point, mostly urban routes around Knoxville. But October of that year, they needed someone to cover a rural mail route up in the Tennessee mountains. The regular carrier, a guy named Jim Morrison, not the singer, obviously had just vanished mid-route one day in early October. Left his truck parked near some remote cabins, mail still in the back, keys in the ignition. No note, no explanation, nothing. The postmaster was pretty shaken up about it, to be honest. Said Jim had been doing that route for 12 years and knew those mountains better than anyone. The thing about mountain mail routes in October is they get absolutely slammed. All those folks living way up in the hollers know winter's coming, and once the snow hits, some of those cabins become completely inaccessible until spring. So October is when everyone orders their supplies, medication, equipment, everything they'll need to survive the isolation. The mail volume triples, sometimes quadruples. It's good overtime money, which I needed at the time since my divorce had just gone through and legal fees had cleaned me out pretty good. The postmaster, Bill Henderson, was nervous about sending anyone up there alone. He kept saying things like, "Just be careful and don't take any unnecessary risks," which honestly made me more worried than reassured. He gave me a detailed map of the route, showed me which cabins to prioritize, and made me promise to radio in every 2 hours. The route covered about 60 miles of winding mountain roads, some barely wide enough for the mail truck, serving maybe 45 addresses scattered across the most remote parts of the county. My first few days went fine, The mountain people were friendly enough, though most kept to themselves. I learned pretty quick that up there, everyone knows everyone, and their families have been in those mountains for generations. They'd eye me suspiciously until I explained I was filling in for Jim, then they'd relax and usually ask if I'd heard anything about what happened to him. I hadn't, of course, but the way they asked made it clear they genuinely cared about the guy. The route itself was actually pretty beautiful once you got used to the narrow roads and steep drops. October, in the Smokies, is something else. All those colors, the air crisp and clean, fog rolling through the valleys in the morning. Some of these cabins were so far back in the woods, you could barely see them from the road, connected by gravel driveways that snaked up hillsides or down into hidden hollows. A few times I had to hike packages in on foot because the truck couldn't make it all the way. It was on my 4th day that things started feeling off. I was making my usual rounds, working my way up toward the most remote cluster of cabins near Caney Creek, when I saw another mail truck parked at the Miller place. That shouldn't have been possible. I was the only carrier assigned to this route. I pulled up behind it, and honestly, I thought maybe Bill had sent someone else up to help with the October rush without telling me. But when I got out and looked at the truck, it was identical to mine. Same model, same year, same scratches and dents, even the same rust spot near the rear wheel well. The license plate was different, but everything else was exactly the same. I walked around to the front, and that's when I saw him. There was a guy in a postal uniform, loading packages from the back of his truck. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and I swear my heart just stopped. He looked exactly like me. Not similar exactly like me. Same height, same build, same face, even the same scar on my left hand from when I'd cut myself working on my car the previous spring. "Oh," he said, and his voice was my voice. "Looks like there's been some kind of mix-up." I just stood there staring at him. He had my face, my movements, even the way I tilted my head when I was confused. He was carrying the mailbag the exact same way I did, with the strap over his right shoulder because my left shoulder sometimes gave me trouble from an old injury. "I'm covering the Caney Creek route," he said, looking just as confused as I felt. "Been doing it all week. You must be the backup they sent?" But I wasn't backup. I was the primary replacement for Jim. And looking at this guy's mailbag, I could see he had mail for the same addresses I was supposed to deliver. The Miller place, the Johnson cabin, the old Hensley farm, all the same stops. "What's your name?" I asked, though I already had a sick feeling about what he was going to say. "David," he said. "David Carlisle." "You?" That was my name. He'd just said my name in my voice while wearing my face. Mrs. Miller came out on her porch then, a sweet old lady who'd always been nice to me. "Oh good," she called out. "Both of my postal boys are here." "David, honey, you got that package I was expecting?" She was talking to him, but she was looking at me like she couldn't tell us apart. Because she couldn't. We were identical. "Yes, ma'am," the other David said, and he pulled out a package with her name on it. "Also got your prescription from the pharmacy in town." He handed it to her with the same smile I would have used, and she thanked him and went back inside like this was completely normal. Like there weren't two identical mail carriers standing in her driveway. I opened my mouth to say something, but he was already walking back to his truck. "Well," he said, "I guess we'll figure this out at the post office. I'll finish up this section and head back." He got in his truck and drove away, leaving me standing there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I delivered Mrs. Miller's other mail. Apparently, she was getting deliveries from both of Sting, us, and spent the rest of the day in a daze. Every time I stopped to think about it, I felt sick. There was no way what I'd seen was possible, but I couldn't deny it had happened. That night, I called Bill Henderson at home and tried to explain what I'd encountered. He listened patiently, then asked if I'd been drinking. When I insisted I was serious, he got quiet for a long time. "David," he said finally, "there's nobody else assigned to that route, just you. And we only have one truck out there." But I'd seen the truck. I'd seen the other David. I'd watched Mrs. Miller accept mail from him like it was perfectly normal. The next morning, I drove the route again, half hoping I wouldn't see the other truck, half terrified that I would. I found it parked at the Johnson cabin, and this time I was ready. I had my phone out, planning to take pictures, get some kind of proof. The other David was sitting on the Johnson's porch, having coffee with old Carl Johnson and talking about hunting season. When he saw me pull up, he waved like we were old friends. "Morning, David," he called out. Carl Johnson squinted at me as I walked up. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Y'all really are twins." David here was just telling me about his brother who works the postal service too. Brother? The other David had told Carl we were brothers. "Yeah," the other David said, grinning. "We get that a lot. People always say we look exactly alike. But we weren't brothers. We weren't even related. This thing, whatever it was pretending to be my brother now, creating a story to explain why there were two of us. I spent the morning following him from stop to stop, watching him interact with the mountain folks. He knew everyone's names, their family histories, their health problems, their routines. He knew that Mrs. Patterson's arthritis got worse when rain was coming, that the Henderson boys were stationed overseas, that old Willie Gross was worried about his cattle getting through the winter. He knew things about these people that I'd been learning all week, but he knew them like he'd been on this route for years. At the Hensley place, I watched him chat with Sarah Hensley about her grandmother's quilt patterns. I'd had that exact same conversation with her 2 days earlier. He was repeating it word for word, down to the way he nodded and said, "That's really something," when she showed him the intricate stitching. That's when I realized he wasn't just copying my appearance. He was copying my interactions, my conversations, my relationships with these people. He was learning to be me by watching me. I tried to talk to him directly when we were both parked at the Caney Creek Bridge, but every time I started to ask him serious questions about who he was or where he came from, he'd deflect or change the subject. He acted confused, like he genuinely didn't understand why I was upset about the situation. "I mean, it's weird that we look so much alike," he said, "but it's not like it's hurting anyone. These folks need their mail either way, right?" But it was hurting someone. It was hurting me. Because the more I watched him, the more I realized he was getting better at being me than I was. His conversations with the residents flowed more naturally. He remembered details I'd forgotten. He moved through the route with a confidence that made it seem like he'd been doing it his whole life. On the third day, I noticed he'd started copying my nervous habits. The way I drummed my fingers on the steering wheel when I was thinking. How I rubbed the back of my neck when I was frustrated. The way I always checked my watch twice before leaving each stop. Little unconscious things I did that I didn't even realize I was doing until I saw him doing them too. That's when I understood what was happening. This thing wasn't just pretending to be me, it was studying me, learning me, becoming me. And once it had absorbed everything it needed, I had a feeling the original wouldn't be necessary anymore. I started paying attention to the details that weren't quite right. His eyes didn't blink often enough. When he smiled, it lasted exactly 3 seconds every time, like he'd timed it. His hands moved just a fraction too slowly, like he had to think about each gesture before making it. And when he thought no one was looking, his face would go completely blank, expressionless, like nobody was home behind those eyes. But the residents couldn't see these things. To them, we were just two brothers who happened to work for the Postal Service and looked remarkably alike. They accepted our presence without question, even seemed to enjoy having two mail carriers to chat with. By the fourth day, I was starting to panic. The other David was talking about how much he loved the route, how he was thinking of requesting a permanent transfer to rural delivery. He mentioned meeting with Bill Henderson to discuss making the assignment official. That night, I drove back into town and went straight to the post office. I needed to see if there were any records of another David Carlisle, any paperwork for a second truck, anything that could explain what was happening. The building was locked, but I had keys for emergencies. Inside, I went straight to the personnel files and vehicle registrations. There was only one David Carlisle on record me. Only one truck assigned to the Caney Creek route mine. According to every official document, the other David didn't exist. But I found something else that made my blood run cold. Jim Morrison's personnel file was still on Bill's desk, along with a police report about his disappearance. At the bottom of the report, there was a note I hadn't seen before. Residents report seeing Morrison delivering mail on October 15th and 16th after official disappearance date. Claims investigated but unsubstantiated. Jim had disappeared on October 14th. But people had seen him or something that looked like him continuing his mail route for 2 more days after that. I spent that night researching everything I could find about disappearances in the area, folklore about shapeshifters, anything that might explain what I was dealing with. The mountains have always had stories about things that can take human form, but I'd never paid attention to them before. Old Cherokee legends about beings that could steal a person's appearance. Appalachian tales about creatures that learned to mimic human behavior by watching from the shadows. One story in particular caught my attention. An old account from the 1940 seconds about a mail carrier who'd claimed he was being followed by an exact duplicate of himself. The man had tried to report it to authorities, but nobody believed him. He'd eventually abandoned his route and moved away from the mountains entirely. The official records showed he'd had a mental breakdown, but reading between the lines, it sounded like exactly what I was experiencing. The next morning, I drove the route one more time, but I was done playing along. When I found the other David at the Patterson place, I confronted him directly. "What are you?" I asked. He looked at me with my own face, tilted his head in that way I did when I was confused, and said, "What do you mean? You're not human. You're not my brother. You're not even real." For just a moment, something shifted in his expression. The mask slipped, and I saw something else looking out through those eyes. Something cold and hungry and ancient. His face stretched just slightly, like the skin was too tight, and I could see that his joints bent in ways that weren't quite right. Then the moment passed, and he was back to looking exactly like me. "You're stressed?" he said in my voice. "This is a big route, lots of responsibility. Maybe you should take a few days off." But Mrs. Patterson had seen it too. She was standing on her porch, staring at both of us with a confused, frightened expression. "David," she said uncertainly, "which one of you is? Which one is real?" That's when I knew I had to get out of there. Whatever this thing was, it was done studying me. It was ready to take my place permanently, and the only reason I was still alive was because it hadn't figured out how to dispose of me without raising questions. I got in my truck and drove. Not back to the post office, not to my apartment, just drove down the mountain as fast as I could without going off the road. In my rearview mirror, I could see the other David standing next to his truck, watching me leave with an expression I'd never seen on my own face before. Something satisfied and patient and terrifyingly final. I called Bill Henderson from a gas station in town and told him I was done with the route, effective immediately. Some kind of family emergency. I couldn't explain what had really happened because I knew how it would sound. Instead, I requested transfer to an urban route, someplace with lots of people and witnesses and no isolated mountain cabins. Bill was disappointed but understanding. He said he'd have to find someone else to finish out the October rush on the Caney Creek route. I almost warned him not to send anyone else up there, but what could I say? That there was something in those mountains that could steal people's identities? That Jim Morrison might still be up there somewhere, or something wearing his face? I moved to a different part of the state within a month. Changed my phone number, closed my social media accounts, made myself as hard to find as possible, because I had the feeling that thing up in the mountains wasn't done with me yet. It had learned to be me, but it might still need the original for reference, for practice, for perfection. Sometimes I wonder what happened to the people on that route. Do they still get their mail from David Carlisle? Is the thing that wears my face still up there, living my life better than I ever did? Has it moved on to copying someone else, adding new identities to its collection? I work downtown routes now, exclusively. Lots of people, lots of witnesses, nothing isolated or remote. I avoid mirrors when I can, because sometimes I catch myself moving in ways that don't feel quite right, and I wonder if that thing left something behind in me, some part of itself that I carried away from the mountains. To this day, I've never taken another temporary assignment, and I never, ever go back to the mountains alone. Looking back now, I think the worst part wasn't seeing something wearing my face. It was realizing how easily I could be replaced, how perfectly something else could step into my life and do it better than I ever had. The residents of Caney Creek probably never even noticed the difference, and sometimes, late at night, I wonder if they ever will. I was 22 when this happened, halfway through my senior year at college studying art photography. I'd been working on my thesis project for months, trying to capture what my professor called the beauty in decay, which basically meant I spent every weekend photographing abandoned buildings and forgotten places. My grandmother lived up in eastern Kentucky near the Daniel Boone National Forest, And when she mentioned an old homestead deep in the hollow behind her property, I knew I had to see it. She said it had been empty since the 70s, that the family just up and left one day, and with October coming on and all those colored leaves, I figured it would be perfect for my project. I drove up on a Thursday morning, the kind of day where everything looks like it belongs on a postcard. The maples were burning red and gold, the oaks still holding onto their rust-colored leaves, and that October sunlight had that particular quality where it makes everything look softer somehow. My grandmother gave me directions to the old logging road that would take me most of the way there. She said I'd have to hike the last half-mile or so, that the road had been washed out years ago. Before I left, she mentioned something about the place having a sad history, that folks around there didn't go near it much anymore. But I figured that was just the kind of story people tell about any old abandoned house. The hike in wasn't bad. The trail was overgrown but still visible, winding down through oak and hickory stands, crossing a little creek twice. I had my camera bag and tripod, nothing else. It was maybe 2 in the afternoon when I first saw the cabin through the trees. It sat in this little clearing, surrounded by these massive oak trees that must have been there since before the cabin was built. The structure itself was beautiful in that haunting way old abandoned places can be, all weathered logs and a sagging porch roof, with actual rocking chairs still sitting there like someone might come back any minute. There was even a rusted clothesline strung between 2 posts, still had a couple wooden pins hanging on it. I started shooting right away. The light was perfect, filtering down through all those colored leaves, creating these patterns of shadow and gold across everything. I took probably 30 or 40 shots of just the exterior. Different angles, different compositions. The cabin looked like it had been frozen in time, like the family had just stepped away for an hour and never came back. Through the windows I could see curtains still hanging, furniture shapes in the darkness. I was so focused on getting the shots I wanted that I didn't review any of the photos until I'd circled the whole building twice. That's when I saw her. I was scrolling back through the images on my camera's screen when I stopped on one of the window shots. There was someone inside, a figure standing in what looked like the front room, just visible through the dusty glass. It was a girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned dress with a high collar. She was looking directly at the camera, directly at me. I know for a fact that cabin was empty when I took that photo. I'd been standing right there, looking at that same window through my viewfinder, and there had been nothing. Just darkness and the vague shapes of furniture. I told myself it had to be some trick of the light, some reflection or shadow that just happened to look like a person. But when I looked at the next few photos I'd taken of that same window, she was in different positions. In one, she was closer to the glass. In another, she'd moved to the side, still watching. My hands started shaking a little bit. I lowered the camera and looked at the actual window with my naked eyes. Nothing. Just glass and darkness and those faded curtains moving slightly in the breeze that was coming through cracks in the walls. But when I raised the camera and I looked at the image on the screen again. She was still there, still staring out at me. I should have left then. That would have been the smart thing to do. But I'm an art student, and this was October in the mountains, and I had a thesis project to finish. Plus, honestly, part of me was fascinated. If my camera was somehow capturing something my eyes couldn't see, that was incredible. Terrifying, but incredible. I took a deep breath and walked up onto the porch. The boards creaked under my weight but held firm. The front door was slightly ajar, swollen wood stuck in the frame, but with enough gap that I could squeeze through. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and damp earth, and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. Metallic, almost. The air felt different in there, heavier somehow, like it was harder to breathe. The front room was just how it looked from outside. Old furniture covered in dust, curtains hanging in shreds, floorboards warped and stained. But what caught my attention were the walls. They were covered in photographs. Dozens of them, maybe 100, all in mismatched frames, all still hanging exactly where someone had placed them decades ago. Family portraits, mostly. Black and white images of stern-looking people in old-fashioned clothing, staring out from behind cracked glass and faded paper. I started photographing them. I couldn't help myself. This was exactly the kind of material I needed for my project. But as I moved through the collection, something started bothering me. The faces kept repeating. Not like family resemblance repeating, but the exact same faces across different decades. Here was a woman in a photo dated 1890, and there she was again in a photo that had to be from the 1930 seconds, based on the clothing and image quality. She hadn't aged at all. Same eyes, same expression, same person. And then I found her. The girl from the window. She was in a portrait dated 1923, standing with a family of 5 other people in front of this very cabin. She was wearing the same dress I'd seen in my camera, the same expression, looking at the camera with that same direct, knowing stare. My camera went off. I hadn't touched the shutter button, but it clicked and fired, the flash lighting up the dim room. I looked at the screen. It had taken a photo of the far corner of the room, where a doorway led deeper into the cabin. In the image, standing in that doorway, was the girl, and behind her, barely visible in the darkness, were others, adults, all of them looking at the camera, all of them looking at me. The camera fired again and again. Each time I looked at the screen, there were more of them. They were closer now, spreading out into the room. In the photos, they were solid, real, as clear as if they'd been standing there in daylight. But when I looked up from the screen with my naked eyes, the room was empty. My grandmother's voice echoed in my head. She'd told me stories when I was little about harvest spirits, about how October was when the dead could walk because the veil was thinnest. I'd thought they were just folk tales, the kind of thing mountain people tell to scare kids and entertain tourists. But standing in that cabin, watching my camera capture things I couldn't see, I started thinking maybe there was more truth to those stories than I'd believed. The camera's battery was at 98%. It had been fully charged when I'd arrived, and I'd taken probably 60 photos already. It should have been down to at least 70%, probably lower. But it hadn't dropped at all. I backed toward the door. The camera fired 3 more times as I moved, like it was taking photos on its own, documenting my retreat. Each image showed the spirits following me, moving with me, keeping pace. When I got to the front door and looked at the last photo, they'd spread out across the room in a line, like they were blocking my path. The girl was in the center, her hand raised like she was waving or beckoning. I should have run, but I didn't. Looking back now, I think part of me was already connected to whatever was in that cabin, because instead of leaving, I sat down on the porch steps and started scrolling through every photo I'd taken. And as I looked at them, I saw the story. The photos formed a sequence. The spirits were showing me what happened to them, using my camera to communicate. The family in the 1923 portrait had been caught in an October blizzard, one of those freak early-season storms that come down from Canada and bury the mountains before anyone expects it. They'd been trapped in the cabin for days, then weeks. The images showed them in different rooms, different poses, deteriorating. The last ones showed empty rooms, empty chairs, waiting. And then the photos showed something else. The spirits had been alone for almost a century, trapped in this cabin, unable to leave. Unable to die completely because they'd never gotten the burial rites, never been found. They were waiting for someone from their family to come back, waiting for someone who understood, who could see them, who could help them. But I wasn't family. I realized that looking at the photos, they'd mistaken me for someone else, some distant relative who shared their features. The girl in the window looked like me. I could see it in the old photos. Same eyes, same bone structure. Maybe we were related somehow, way back. Mountain families were all connected if you went back far enough. The camera fired again. I looked at the image. It was a photo of the dinner table inside the cabin, taken from a position I hadn't been standing in. The table was set. 6 places, all with plates and silverware that looked pristine, perfect. And 1 extra place at the end, waiting for me. I heard footsteps inside the cabin, slow, deliberate, moving toward the door. That's when I finally looked at my reflection in the camera's blank screen. My face was translucent. I could see the wood grain of the porch behind me, visible through my own cheeks. I was fading. The camera had been taking more than pictures. It had been taking pieces of my soul, trapping them in those images, the same way the spirits were trapped. I looked at the battery indicator. Still, 98%. It wasn't measuring power anymore. It was measuring me. How much of me was left in the real world? How much had already crossed over, The sun was setting. I could see it through the trees, that orange October light fading to purple. My grandmother had told me the stories, said Halloween was when the transformation would be permanent, when the veil would seal shut and trap whatever crossed over. I checked my phone. October 30th. I had less than a day. The camera started firing rapidly, like a machine gun, photo after photo after photo. I watched my battery percentage drop with each shot. 97, 96, 95. Each photo was taking more of me, pulling me further across. When it hit 0, I'd be gone completely. I tried to delete the photos, every single one, but as soon as I'd delete an image, the camera would fire again, taking another. I'd lost ground. I tried to turn the camera off, but the power button didn't respond. Tried to take out the battery, but the compartment wouldn't open. The camera had become something else, something that existed halfway between worlds, anchored to both. The spirits were on the porch now. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees. I could see my breath. The wooden boards creaked under invisible weight. And when I lifted the camera one more time, I saw all of them. The entire family gathered around me in a circle. The girl was right in front of me, reaching for my hand. In the photo, she looked happy, relieved, like I was saving them by joining them. That's when I remembered something my grandmother had said about old cameras. The really old ones, from the 1800s, when people thought photography was magic because they didn't understand the science. They believed cameras stole your soul. That's why people in old photos look so serious, so scared. They thought if they smiled, more of their soul would leak out through the expression. What if they'd been right? What if these spirits had been trapped because someone had taken their photo at the exact moment of death, capturing their souls before they could move on? And now my camera, here in this place where the veil was thinnest, had become the same kind of tool. A soul trap. I couldn't delete digital photos, but I could destroy film. And this camera, despite being modern, had one old-fashioned feature. It could still take film cartridges. My photography professor had made us all buy hybrid cameras so we could learn both digital and analog techniques. I'd loaded a roll of 35mm film that morning, wanting to have both options for my thesis. The film. I had to expose the film. I ran. Not away from the cabin, but toward my car where I'd left my backup bag. The spirits followed. I could feel them around me, pressing close, trying to slow me down. The temperature dropped further. My breath came in gasps, not just from running, but from the air itself becoming thinner, harder to breathe. The camera kept firing, the battery percentage dropping with each shot. 88, 85, 82. I reached the car just as the sun touched the horizon. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys in the lock. I grabbed the backup bag, dumped everything out onto the hood. Extra film cartridges, lens cleaner, memory cards. Things I'd need. I grabbed the film and ran back toward the cabin. The spirits were waiting at the edge of the clearing. I could see them now with my naked eyes, not just through the camera. They'd become solid as the sun set. The girl was still in front, but she wasn't smiling anymore. Her face had changed. Looked older. Angry. The other spirits had spread out in a line, blocking my path. I didn't have a choice. I had to get inside that cabin and destroy the original photos on the wall, the ones that had started all of this. Those had to be the anchor points, the things keeping the spirits here. If I could destroy them, maybe it would break the connection. Maybe the spirits could finally move on. Maybe I could stay alive. I ran at them, ran right through the line. It felt like pushing through ice water, that shock of cold that stops your heart for a second. But I made it through. Made it to the cabin door. Inside, the photos on the wall were glowing, actually glowing like they had light sources behind them. And they were moving. The figures in the portraits were moving, turning to watch me, reaching toward me from inside their frames. I could hear them now, voices calling my name, but not my real name. They were calling me Sarah. That must have been their daughter. The one who left. The one who never came back. I grabbed the first photo and smashed it against the floor. The glass shattered. The image beneath began to smoke, curling at the edges. The cabin filled with this sound, this wail that wasn't quite human. The spirits screamed. I smashed another. working my way around the room, destroying every photo I could reach. The spirits swarmed me. I felt their hands on my shoulders, my arms, ice cold and desperate. They were trying to pull me down, stop me. The camera fired again and again, the battery now at 42%. Less than half of me left in the real world. I got to the photo of the girl, the one from 1923. Her image was moving in the frame, mouth open in a silent scream. I hesitated for just a second. She looked so sad, so lost. But then I thought about my life, my family, my future, everything I'd lose if I stayed here. I brought the frame down hard on the edge of an old table. The crack sounded like thunder. The glass exploded. The photo beneath began to burn, actual flames licking up from the paper even though there was no fire source. The cabin itself seemed to shudder. Dust fell from the ceiling. The walls groaned. And then everything went silent. I stood in the middle of that room, surrounded by broken glass and smoking photographs, and the cabin was empty. Completely empty. The temperature returned to normal. The pressure in the air released. The spirits were gone. I looked at my camera. The battery indicator had frozen at 38%. I was translucent when I looked at my hands, but I was still here. Still alive. Still mostly solid. The sun had fully set. It was dark outside. October 30th was ending. I had maybe an hour before Halloween began. Before whatever this was became permanent. I gathered every piece of film I had, the cartridge in my camera, the backup rolls, everything. I carried them outside and laid them on the porch where the morning sun would hit them first. Then I took the memory cards from my camera and did the same. Everything that had captured images in that cabin, everything that had pieces of me trapped inside. I spent that night in my car, parked on that old logging road, engine running, heater on full blast, doors locked. I didn't sleep. I watched the clock, counting down the minutes until dawn. Every creak, every sound made me jump. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, terrified I'd see them standing behind the car. But they never came. The sun rose at 6:47 a.m. on October 31st. I watched it creep over the mountains, that first light touching the tops of the trees and then slowly sliding down toward the hollow. The moment it reached the cabin's porch, I heard a sound like glass breaking, like ice shattering, and then nothing. I waited another hour before I went back to check. The film cartridges had all split open, the film exposed and ruined. The memory cards had cracked, like they'd frozen and thawed too fast. And when I looked at my hands, they were solid again. Completely solid. The camera's battery indicator had reset to 0. The device was dead. It never worked again, no matter what I tried. I changed my major after that, switched from art to social work. I couldn't look at a camera without seeing that battery percentage dropping, without feeling the cold touch of those spirits reaching for me. Every photo I see now, family pictures or yearbook shots or anything, I look for things that don't belong. Figures in the background, faces in windows, people who shouldn't be there. And sometimes, I swear I see them. Little hints of the other side bleeding through. I'm 25 now. I haven't been back to Kentucky. I don't talk to my grandmother much anymore because she keeps asking why I stopped visiting, and I can't explain. How do you tell someone that their family land is haunted by spirits who think you're their long-lost relative? How do you explain that you almost became a ghost yourself, trapped in photographs for eternity? Every October, I feel this pull, this urge to go back to that cabin, to see if the spirits moved on or if they're still waiting there, calling for Sarah, calling for me. My new camera sits in a drawer, unopened. I tell people I just lost interest in photography, that I found a different passion. But the truth is, I'm terrified that if I ever look through a viewfinder again, I'll see them. The family, the girl, all of them still watching, still waiting. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I wonder if I really escaped at all. Because when I look in the mirror now, when the light hits just right, I swear I can see through myself. Just a little bit. Like 38% of me is somewhere else, still in that cabin, still trapped in those photographs, still becoming part of the family portrait. I'm 26 years old, and I work as a UPS driver out of Charleston, West Virginia. Been doing it for about 3 years now. mostly the city routes where I know every stop by heart. It's decent money, good benefits, and honestly, I like being on the road instead of stuck in some office. My girlfriend Sarah's always on me about applying for a management position, but I don't know. Something about being out there, just me and the truck, feels right. Anyway, this happened last October when I was covering for Danny, one of the rural route drivers who'd called in sick during the busy shipping season. I'd never done his route before, but dispatch said it was simple enough, just follow the GPS and drop the packages where it tells you. I should have known better. The route started normal enough. I left the depot around 7 a.m. with a full load, mostly hunting gear and camping supplies people had ordered online. Makes sense for October in West Virginia hunting season, brings out everybody and their uncle into the mountains. The first dozen stops went smooth, just farms and little houses scattered along Route 60. But around 3 p.m., I got to this one address that my GPS kept insisting was another 40 minutes up into the mountains. The pin dropped way out there, middle of nowhere, and I remember thinking it was weird because the package was just some batteries and a few magazines. Not exactly emergency supplies that justify living that far from civilization. The paved road turned to gravel about 20 minutes in, then the gravel turned to just dirt and ruts. My GPS kept recalculating every few miles, like it couldn't quite figure out where I was. The sun was already getting low, dropping behind the ridgeline, and those mountain shadows stretch out long and cold in October. The trees up there are mostly bare by then, just skeletal branches against the sky, and I could see my breath inside the cab even with the heat running. I should have turned back. That's what I tell myself now. But I had a package to deliver, and I was trying to prove I could handle the rural routes just as good as Danny. When I finally got to where the GPS said the address should be, there was nothing. No house, no mailbox, just an old hunting cabin, set back about 50 yards from where the road, if you could even call it that anymore, just sort of ended. The cabin looked abandoned, maybe from the 80s, based on the way the wood had weathered and the style of the small windows. There were a couple of deer stands in the trees nearby, completely overgrown with vines, and through the cabin's grimy windows I could see old trophy mounts on the walls inside. Buck heads with their antlers still intact, gathering dust. The whole place had that feeling of somewhere people used to go but don't anymore. I tried calling dispatch, but my phone showed no signal. Not even one bar. That didn't make sense because I'd had service just 10 miles back down the mountain. I walked around the cabin, looking for any sign someone lived there. Maybe a generator, fresh tire tracks, anything, but there was nothing. Just old leaves piled up against the walls and some claw marks on the doorframe that I figured were from raccoons or maybe a bear. The marks went pretty high up the wall though, higher than I would have expected. I decided to wait until I could get back down the mountain where I'd have signal to call this in. It was almost 5 p.m. by then, and the sun was dropping fast. That's when my truck wouldn't start. I turned the key and got nothing. Not even a click. The battery was completely dead, which made no sense because the truck was brand new and I'd been driving it all day without any problems. I tried a few more times, then popped the hood to check the connections, but everything looked fine. The battery terminals were clean, cables were tight, no corrosion or anything that would explain a total power loss. And that's when I noticed how quiet it was. I mean, really quiet. I grew up in West Virginia. I know what mountain quiet sounds like. There's always something. Birds, insects, squirrels rustling in the leaves, wind moving through the trees. But standing there by my dead truck as the sun touched the ridgeline, I couldn't hear anything. No birds at all. No insects, even though there should have been plenty still active in early October. No wind, even though I could see the branches swaying slightly. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the whole forest. I walked over to one of the old deer stands to get a better view of the area, maybe spot a house or a road I'd missed. When I climbed up about 10 feet, I could see for maybe a mile in each direction, and there was nothing, just trees and more trees, turning into shadows as the light failed. But what got my attention were the tracks in the mud near the stand. Fresh tracks, lots of them, all heading away from this area. Deer tracks, turkey tracks, even what looked like bear tracks. All of them heading downhill, away from the cabin, like something had spooked every animal in the area at the same time. Looking back now, that should have been my cue to start walking. Forget the truck, forget my job, just get out of there. But I'm not a superstitious guy, and I told myself I was being paranoid. Animals migrate, patterns change. There could be 100 logical reasons why it was quiet and why the local wildlife had moved on. I decided to wait in the cabin until morning, then hike back down to where I'd have cell service and call for help. It seemed reasonable at the time. The cabin door wasn't locked, just old and swollen in the frame. I had to put my shoulder into it to get it open. Inside, the air smelled like dust and old wood and something else, something vaguely metallic that made the back of my throat taste weird. The trophy mounts I'd seen through the window were even creepier up close. 7 or 8 deer heads, all bucks, all staring with those glass eyes. There was an old couch that mice had gotten into, a wood stove that looked functional, and a shelf with some ancient hunting magazines from the 80s. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but I started flipping through them while I had light. That's when I found the articles about the missing hunters. October 1984. 2 hunters vanished from this area. October 1985. Another one gone. October 1986. 3 more. The articles were all clipped from different newspapers and magazines, stored in this cabin like someone was keeping track. Each one mentioned the same basic details: experienced hunters who went out during opening weekend and never came back. No bodies found, no blood, no signs of struggle, just gone. And they'd all disappeared during the full moon in October. I checked my phone calendar. Tonight was the full moon. The light was almost gone by then, just a deep purple glow through the windows. I found a battery-powered lantern in the cabin that still worked and set it on the table. Then I started looking for anything I could use to secure the doors and windows. There were some old boards and nails, a hammer that was rusty but functional. While I was checking the back door, I saw them, the claw marks. They weren't from raccoons. The scratches went up the back wall of the cabin at least 12 feet high, deep gouges in the wood that looked fresh. Well, not fresh exactly, but not decades old either. Whatever made them was big, way bigger than a bear. The marks had that same spacing as fingers, if fingers were twice as long as they should be, and ended in claws that could bite an inch into hard wood. I put my hand up to them for comparison, and my entire hand fit inside just one of the claw marks. I boarded up the windows. It took me maybe 30 minutes to nail boards across all the windows and reinforce the doors with the furniture. The cabin wasn't big, just one main room and a tiny back room that might have been for storage. I piled everything I could against the doors and made sure there weren't any gaps big enough for something to reach through. The whole time I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, that I was probably safe from whatever black bear had made those marks, but my hands were shaking and I couldn't stop checking the windows every few seconds. By 7 p.m., it was full dark outside. The moon came up huge and orange, that harvest moon that hunters love because you can see so well by it. I kept the lantern on low and sat on the couch with the hammer in my lap, trying to reason through what I'd do in the morning. Walk down to where I'd had signal, call dispatch. Maybe call Sarah and tell her I was okay. Get someone to come tow the truck. Simple plan. Just had to wait until sunrise. That's when I heard the howl. It wasn't like any coyote or wolf I'd ever heard. Those sound wild but also natural, you know? This was different. It started low, almost like a moan, then climbed up into something that made every hair on my body stand up, and it was close, maybe 50 yards from the cabin. The sound echoed off the ridgelines, bouncing back and forth across the valley. And when it finally faded, I heard something else, an answer, from the opposite direction. Then another answer, and another. 3, maybe 4 different calls, all surrounding the cabin, all with that same wrong quality that made my stomach drop. I thought about those articles. The missing hunters, October, full moon. The animal tracks all leading away from this place. Something big moved past the window. I saw it through a gap in the boards, just a shape, dark against the moonlight, but tall, way too tall. It moved past the window in 3 strides, and each stride must have covered 6 feet. I held my breath and didn't move. The boards creaked. Something was testing them, pushing against them from outside, and I could hear this wet breathing sound right up against the wall. Then it moved on. I waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Nothing but silence and my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. Then I heard something that almost made me scream my own voice, coming from outside the cabin. "Hello, is someone there?" It was my voice exactly, the same tone I'd used when I first walked up to the cabin. "I'm looking for an address. Can anyone help me?" My actual voice was trapped in my throat. I couldn't have answered even if I wanted to. The voice outside kept calling, kept using my own words, but there was something just slightly off about the timing, like someone had recorded me and was playing it back just a fraction too slow. "Hello? My truck broke down. I need help." The voice circled the cabin. I could track its position by the sound. It was trying to get me to respond, to open the door, to give away my exact position inside. I stayed silent and still, barely breathing, while my own voice called out into the darkness. Then it stopped talking and started testing the door. The handle rattled. Something heavy hit the door, making the whole frame shudder. I heard scratching, heard something that sounded like tools, rocks, maybe striking against the boards I'd nailed up. Whatever was out there, it was trying to problem-solve its way inside. It wasn't just acting on instinct, it was thinking. I stood up and backed into the corner farthest from the door. Hammer raised. Through the gaps in the boards, I could see moonlight and shadows, and then I saw it a face. I can't really describe it properly. It was almost human, but the proportions were wrong. The eyes were too far apart and reflected the moonlight like an animal's eyes, yellow and bright. The face was covered in dark fur or hair, but the features underneath were organized like a person's face, just stretched and elongated. It looked at me through the gap, and I saw its mouth open. There were too many teeth. "We've been hunting the hunters," it said, and this time the voice wasn't mimicking mine. It was deep and broken, like something that had learned English but didn't have the right throat structure to speak it properly. "For generations, you came during our season." The face disappeared from the gap. I heard something heavy land on the roof. The next 4 hours were the worst of my life. I'm not going to describe every second of it, but there were multiple creatures, at least 3 or 4 based on the different sounds and voices. They worked together, coordinating their attacks on different parts of the cabin, using rocks to smash at the boards, using branches to try to pry open gaps. They never stopped completely. When one would rest, another would take over. It was systematic, intelligent, like they were taking shifts. They mimicked other voices too. Sarah's voice, calling for me. My mom's voice. Dispatch calling my name. They'd copied them from my phone somehow, pulled them out of voicemails or calls. One of them even mimicked Danny, the regular driver, telling me to open the door so he could relieve me from the route. Every instinct screamed at me that these things were trying to trick me, but my hands kept wanting to reach for the door anyway, just to make the voices stop. Around 2 a.m., they tried fire. I smelled smoke and saw orange light through the gaps. They'd piled brush against the wall and lit it, but the cabin was old and damp, and the wood wouldn't catch, just smoldered and filled the place with smoke. I had to press my shirt against my face and get low to breathe. But the fire drove them back for a while, gave me maybe an hour of relative quiet. At 3:47 a.m., I remember the exact time because I kept checking my dead phone like somehow the clock might give me comfort. One of them spoke again. Different voice this time, older sounding, more confident with the English. "October is ours," it said. "Hunters come. We hunt them. Balance, you understand?" I didn't answer. My throat was raw from smoke and fear. I just held the hammer and waited. "Dawn," it said. "We leave at dawn. You leave too. Tell other hunters, October is ours." Then they were quiet, no more attacks. No more testing the walls. I could hear them out there, moving around the cabin, but they weren't trying to get in anymore. They were just waiting, like I was. The sun came up at 6:23 a.m. I watched through the gaps as the light changed from black to blue to gray to that pale yellow of early morning. The moment the first direct sunlight hit the cabin wall, I heard them leave. Not running exactly, but moving fast, heading upslope into the deeper mountains. I counted to 1,000 before I even thought about opening the door. When I finally pushed the furniture aside and stepped outside, the forest was normal again. Birds singing, squirrels chattering. The air felt different, lighter, like some kind of pressure had lifted. The tracks around the cabin told the story, massive footprints in the mud, bipedal, with those long clawed toes. They led up into the rocks where they'd be impossible to follow. My truck started on the first try. I didn't question it. I just got in, turned around in about 15 frantic points, and drove back down that mountain road faster than was probably safe. I hit cell service about 20 minutes down and immediately called dispatch. Told them the truck had battery problems, but I'd gotten it started, and I was heading back. didn't mention anything else. What would I even say? I returned to Charleston by 10 a.m., returned the truck, told my supervisor I couldn't do rural routes anymore, that I needed to stay on the city routes. He looked at me funny but agreed. I think he could tell something had shaken me. I never went back to get that package delivered. The weird thing is, about 2 months later, they closed that whole area to hunting, made it a wildlife preserve. The news said it was for conservation reasons, protecting some endangered species habitat. They didn't say what species. I looked at the maps online, and the preserve boundaries are basically a 5-mile radius around that cabin. Nobody's allowed up there anymore, especially not in October. I still work for UPS, still drive the same city route. Sarah and I got married last spring, and she knows something happened up there, but she doesn't push me about it. I've got this thing now where I can't be outside during the October full moon. I literally cannot do it. We'll be in the house, doors locked, curtains drawn, and she doesn't question it because she can see how serious I get. Sometimes at night, I'll hear coyotes or dogs howling in the distance, normal animal sounds, and my body just freezes up. I'll be transported right back to that cabin, hearing those voices that weren't quite right, seeing those eyes reflecting the moonlight. And I think about those missing hunters from the 80s, about how the article stopped after 1986, about how those things said they'd been hunting hunters for generations, like it was just part of the natural cycle up there. I've gone down some rabbit holes online, reading about cryptozoology and unexplained disappearances in Appalachia. There are other stories, other people who've seen things they can't explain. Most people don't talk about it because they sound crazy, but I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know why those deer stands were empty and why every animal had fled that area. October is their season, and they're very good at what they do. I don't deliver packages up mountain roads anymore, city routes only. And if someone asks me why, I just tell them I prefer staying close to home. It's easier than trying to explain that there are places in these mountains where humans aren't the apex predator, where something older and smarter has marked its territory, and where going out during the full moon in October isn't a good idea. I still have the hammer from that cabin, brought it back with me, without really thinking about it. It's in my garage now, and sometimes I'll pick it up and just hold it, remembering that night, remembering the sound of my own voice calling to me from the darkness, remembering those yellow eyes watching me through the gap in the boards. They let me live. That's what I think about most. They could have gotten in if they really wanted to. The cabin wasn't that secure. But they chose to let me go when the sun came up, like there were rules to what they were doing. Hunt the hunters, keep the balance, warn the others. So I'm warning you, if you hunt in the West Virginia mountains, maybe skip October. Or at least stay out of the wildlife preserves. Because what's protecting that land isn't just conservation laws. It's something that's been there a lot longer than any of us. And they're not going anywhere.